It is daunting to talk about the history of immunology at the Walter Eliza Hall Institute in the presence of so many of those who contributed to that history, and of course, for much of it, I wasn't a part of it, so I hope I can do it justice. I've very much assisted in my task here with these two books, which cover already 80 years of the history of the Walter Eliza Hall Institute. The first book, the first 50 years there, from the Mcfarland Burnett, and the next 30 there by Sir Gus Nossal. Of course, these two books differ quite significantly in tone. The first, from Mcfarland Burnett, is really the cautious building of the Research Institute and its work. And with Sir Gus Nossal, we see the launch of the Institute into world attention and the broadening of its scope. So, of course, the last 20 years of the 100 that we will talk about is yet to be written, and I'm not going to focus too much on that, but I assure you that the next 100 are well and truly incubating in the labs here, and I think beautifully. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. This is the first session. We're celebrating 100 years, so this is where it all starts. That's Walter Hall on the left there. He was a millionaire, made a lot of money through the Mount Morgan gold mine. When he died in 1911, he left £2 million to his wife, Eliza, and Eliza recruited Robert Casey to help her disperse the money. £1 million went to the 52 relatives of the whole family, apparently, and £1 million went to the setting up of a trust. That trust, Richard Casey came to the Uni Melbourne and talked to a Professor Harry Allen, and Harry Allen suggested they should donate the money to the university and create a series of professorships. The trust rejected that idea and said they wanted to start or contribute to an institute. And Harry Allen thought about that, and he wrote a famous letter, which I've called the creation letter for the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. Here it is here, reproduced by Mac Burnett in his book. You can see the appropriate date, 10th of January 1915, so we're 100 years. It makes the point here that if the trustees are prepared to accept the proposals with any modifications, such an institute as the Southern Hemisphere has never known. So, and then he suggests Clunies Matheson as a potential director. As you know, that was taken up, although he died at Gallipoli subsequently. But the trust, after some negotiation, agreed to this, that they would provide £2,500 per year. And the trustees, and on accepting this, especially hoped that the Institute would be the birthplace of discoveries rendering signal service to mankind in the prevention and removal of disease and the mitigation of suffering. Okay, so that was £1 million donated to the trust, largest single donation in Australian history. It's about $100 million by today's money. 15,000 of those pounds set up the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. And so you're surprised, as I was, to learn that there was an awful lot of the trust left, and the trust still is running as an independent philanthropic organisation, separate from the Institute. Okay, so the early years, Melbourne Hospital, Lonsdale Street, in 1916, because of the war and because Matheson, who was approached to be the first director, died, nothing really got going until 1916. Harry Allen became the acting director. They recruited Sidney Patterson, a pathologist. He arrived in 1919 and left a few years later. And it wasn't really until 1923, with the recruitment of Charles Kellaway as the director, that the Institute got underway. And as we're concentrating on immunology, there is a little bit of immunological interest here. He worked on the development of antivenoms for Australian snakes and spiders, important for the new settlers. He also used venoms to study the inflammatory response, identifying a substance, slow reactive substance A, which turned out to be discovered back many years later in the 1980s to be the leukotrienes. And so antagonists are quite useful in some asthmatic conditions now. So that was one of the first contributions, if you like, to immunity from the emerging Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. That's That's Kellaway there. In the Second World War, he was drafted back to the army. Okay. But of course, where it really gets interesting is Kellaway's outstanding protege, Frank Mcfarland Burnett, who was a Melbourne medical student and graduate in 1924. He went off to London to do a PhD and came back to the Walter Eliza Hall Institute, recruited by Kellaway. He became the deputy director from 1929 to 44 with a 3-year return back to the National Institute of Medical Research in Hampstead in England again to gain more experience. And at that time, he became an expert on growing viruses in eggs and using the allantoic fluids and the chorea and allantoic membranes to grow different types of viruses, particularly influenza. And he used this technique to great effect when he came back to Australia. Here we have a quote from Sir Gus Nossal. If Kellaway was the man who built the Hall Institute into a credible and respected research centre for which the Australian medical science owes him an immense debt, it was certainly Burnett who ensured that it joined the small elite band of institutions which at the global level represent the driving force behind world medical progress. That's high praise for one man. As we'll see, thoroughly deserved. He, of course, worked on many different viral diseases and earned an international reputation in virology. But we're talking about immunology, and he, of course, initiated a great immunology revolution. He was a thinking generalist and synthesizer, and this was the question that puzzled him through the 30s and 40s. What is immunity? What is happening when you're immunizing? In 1940, he wrote a monograph where he speculated that we must be able to distinguish self from not self. He coined those terms and posed the question for the first time. And as a consequence, he rejected the dogma of the day, a template, so-called template hypothesis for how antibodies would be made. In 1949, he wrote a book with Frank Fenner, a colleague here at the Walter Eliza Hall Institute, called The Production of Antibodies. And in this book, they summarise all the known information about immunity at the time. And in 2007, I interviewed Professor Av Mitchison, who was in England at the time this book appeared. He didn't know Burnett or Fenner, but this book appeared, and I interviewed him about the impact of this book on the labs in England. I hope this runs.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind at all that in anybody beginning in immunology, and it wouldn't even be called immunology in those days, it might have been called immunopathology, or it might have been called antibacterial activity, and so on and so forth. But anybody interested in that area in the early 1950s was profoundly influenced by the Burnett and Fenner monograph. That was a huge step forward. And it was a step forward because it told us that there were these phenomena, the primary response and secondary response, and the development of titers of antibody after a single injection of antigen, which needed explanation, which were a real challenge to anybody thinking about how what's now called the immune system. That term came in much later, but how we would now say how the immune system worked. We loved that book.
We loved that book. I like that quote. Okay, and amongst many ideas in this book, there was a new one, that you would learn self from non-self, and you would do this early in life. This quote, if in embryonic life expendable cells from a genetically distinct race are implanted and established, no antibody response would develop against the foreign cell antigen when the animal takes on independent existence. And this sentence really inspired Peter Medawar, who Av Mitchison was working with a bit later, inspired their team in London to attempt to induce tolerance to allow tissue grafting between distinct individuals, and this turned out to work. So this was a very important theoretical development in our understanding of self-tolerance. Okay, but now we're getting closer now to the clonal selection theory. And there's in 1946, Burnett set up the clinical research unit attached to the Royal Melbourne Hospital and the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. It was headed by Ian Wood. And around about 1955, 3 workers to the clinical research unit, Richard Joschke, William King and Ian Mackay, discovered that some patients with chronic active hepatitis were making autoantibodies. And shortly thereafter, Carlton Gajusek and Mackay found that some patients with macroglobulinemia also had high titers of autoantibodies. This association of what Burnett presumed to be a malignant clone of cells and the production of forbidden anti-self antibody fascinated Burnett and really got him thinking about what must be happening when it goes wrong and when it goes right in making immunity. The other clue, in 1955, another scientist, Niels Yerner, published an idea that all the different specificities of antibody may be made before you are exposed to something foreign. That the foreign material somehow selected amongst the millions of possibilities the appropriate binding antibody and made copies of it in some way, although he didn't really know what that mechanism might be. Burnett was initially skeptical, but he synthesized all of this in 1957 into this paper, a single paper, 1 page of introduction, and then the second page introduces many new fields of immunology in a very succinct form. This is reproduced in 2007 in the 50th anniversary. You managed to reproduce this in Nature Immunology. We celebrated the theory here with the Power of One Idea conference in 2007, as you see here. And in Nature Immunology editorial, I put a quote here: Burnett's clonal selection theory not only had great implications for modern immunology, but was also monumental in spearheading research in Australia. In 1957, he announced a switch from virology to immunology at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. And this was instrumental in attracting some of the great names of immunology, and what followed was a series of key discoveries that have given Australian immunology research a world-class reputation. Okay, so the move to immunology in late 1957, Ian Wood talks about it here. Ian Mackay says, reminiscing in one of the annual reports, that exciting years followed that memorable day in 1957. Burnett actually called the staff together and told them that they were no longer going to do virology, they were going to move to immunology. Burnett summoned the staff to the seminar room to announce that work on virology would stop because he wished to devote the remainder of his working career, he was the director, remember, to making some significant contribution to immunology. Extraordinary decision. Now, so Ian Wood again. With the switch to studies in immunology in 1957, the whole picture changed. Consideration of immune reactions, normal and abnormal, had a deep impact on clinical medicine. It opened a wide and fascinating vista of clinical findings which has supported many of Burnett's ideas. So, skipping again, gradually the concept of autoimmune diseases became more soundly established with increasing experience and discovery of new tests for immune reactions and tissue changes. This is in the clinical research unit here at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. For more and more diseases whose clinical picture was well known but whose cause was unknown, the possibility of an autoimmune etiology was considered. Lupus erythematosus, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, rheumatoid arthritis, pernicious anemia, myasthenia gravis, leukoid hepatitis, and some forms of hemolytic anemia. You can imagine the excitement at finding a whole immune underpinning of this whole class of diseases emerging before their eyes. Ian Wood retired in 1963, and he wrote that chronic active hepatitis had been recognised for several years, but the subgroup leukoid hepatitis had been identified in the unit as an autoimmune disease, and his patients mostly responded well. And this is the other point. Having identified as autoimmune these conditions, you could treat them with anti-immune drugs, and they were quite effective. And so Ian Wood says that his patients mostly responded well to prednisolone and azathioprine, and they enjoyed a full and active life for 10 years or more. And so this was an important development, emerging very quickly from the clonal selection theory and the work of the clinical research unit here. Sorry, the success. So where does the success in gaining the hearts and minds of world immunology? Of course, this was now a battle that Burnett had undertook. And there are three critical confidence boosts, I think, to his... The first was that there was a sabbatical visit by a leading American scientist, geneticist Joshua Lederberg. The year in 1958, he was to win the Nobel Prize. But he became fascinated by the clonal selection theory and became a great champion of it in the US. Of course, Gus Nossel had arrived in 1957 to work with Burnett on virology, but he also became diverted to study the one-cell, one-antibody prediction of the clonal selection theory. And of course, his charisma and great enthusiasm, I'm sure Burnett saw already a great champion and communicator for the future of immunology there, and that proved to be correct. And then a little bit later, in 1960, Burnett received the Nobel Prize for the 1949 immune theory about tolerance. And of course, that gave him great gravitas, great platform to expound his theory further around the world. Now, the Immunology Award in 1960 was with Peter Medawar for immunological tolerance. And it was always curious until 50 years later when they released the notes for the deliberations of the committee as to why Burnett received an immunology prize at that time when he was so renowned for virology. And Erling Norbing, who writes this Nobel Prizes in the Life Sciences book, solved the problem. Sven Gard, the chairman of the committee, put Burnett and Medawar together because Medawar had been nominated for the immunological tolerance and Burnett was nominated for virology. And it was Sven Gard who realised he could put them together and get two for the price of one. Burnett, it turns out, had never been nominated for that particular contribution to the Nobel Prize. He had, of course, been nominated many times for virology, as also revealed in the book after the notes became available. You can see here where it says Burnett had, since 1948, been nominated every year for discoveries made in virus research. In 1950, it was in fact proposed by 4 dissenting members out of 13 that Burnett should share a prize with Tyler. So he almost won it 10 years earlier for virology, so clearly Nobel worthy. But of course, by 1965, there was general acceptance that the clonal selection theory was correct. Summarised here with this quote from Niels Yerner. Remember the idea who came up with the original sort of concept that triggered Burnett in the right direction. The enormous advances since 1957 in our knowledge of the immune system have proven Burnett's hypothesis to be basically correct, even in its very first formulation. No further comments are needed. In summary, I hit the nail, but Burnett hit the nail on its head. Okay, 1965 is also the year that Burnett retired from the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute and handed over the reins to the new star, Gus Nossel. And there are tremendously contrasting styles, as you can see here. This is the old tea room, and this is Sir Gus launching the new era of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. He says, Burnett had left a legacy of superb intellectual strength. The Institute was contributing in a major way to the rebirth of immunology and its influence on biomedicine. Yet in the meantime, two cracks had appeared. The Institute was badly under-equipped and under-financed. It also had a narrow skill base. And so he set about fixing that. And I found this in his book, proudly at the end, illustrating right at the beginning of that graph is the funding as Burnett left it. And you can see the very rapid increase in funding, both in the research budget and the growth of the endowment, extraordinary exponential growth that Gus Nossel was able to achieve here. And of course, he managed to build extra floors and eventually moved the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute to this beautiful building that forms half of our current building. So he modernised and diversified the research units. I think I'm going to be running out of time soon, right? So very quickly. So new units, beautiful looking unit heads here. You may not recognise some of them. That's Ken Shortman. Ian Mackay, Suzanne Corey, Jerry Adams, Graham Mitchell over there. Okay, and there were many highlights. Of course, the recruitment of Jacques Miller was a very important launching of further world attention. And of course, with Miller and Mitchell, the discovery of the collaboration between T and B lymphocytes was a great contribution. There are many more to talk about. It's an enormous history to talk about in a few minutes, and I apologise for going so quickly. Of course, I have to say that immunology continues apace at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. Many great things continuing to work beautifully here. There are great secrets, I think, as to what Gus Nossel managed to bring to the culture of the Institute that inspired so many great discoveries. One is, of course, Vegemite and the lubrication of conversation at morning and afternoon tea. The other I discovered as I went through all the database of pictures for the Institute is just cake. There's cakes everywhere. Every major event seems to have been celebrated with cakes, and including the Centenary. There's the Centenary cake. And I just wanted to give the last word back to the great Sir Mcfarland Burnett. When he retired in 1965, he went across the road to an honorary position at the University of Melbourne and wrote 13 books. Here's one of them, Immunological Surveillance. And in this book, he speculated on the importance of cancer for the development of the immune response and the immune response in protecting people against cancers. It's a highly controversial book. Here's a quote. It's hard to avoid the opinion that if human beings lacked either a diversity of histocompatibility antigens or capacity for homograft immunity, graft rejection, if you like, cancer would be a highly contagious disease of great evolutionary significance. I therefore assumed that in some way the danger of infectious cancer had led to the evolution of adaptive immunity. Bold predictions from 1970. He also says there that an optimist might take this theory as a hint that a full understanding of the surveillance function of the immune response against cancers of a malignant disease could lead to a significant prolongation of lifespan. As yet, there's no real justification for such dreams. But of course, in 2015, we have very real hope of immunotherapy for cancer, as anticipated, if you like, by Burnett here. Immunology in cancer is the infectious form of cancer. We have a great example also in Australia with the Tasmanian devil being decimated by an infectious form of cancer. I think, again, bringing home the idea that the immune response plays an important role in such protection. And I think I'll just leave it there by saying this synthesis of immunology in cancer that's so strong now at the current Walter and Eliza Hall Institute is a very strong base for another 100 years of medical research. Thanks.